Paul, good morning, good afternoon. Not sure where you are. How are you doing today?
Good morning to you, and thanks for the opportunity. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too. Listen, Paul, we have an audience of executives and leaders from SMEs from around Europe. And I'd like you to speak a little bit about your book, Net Positive, which is something that we always recommend to all of our courses to engage in. And I wanted to begin with asking you, what are the key messages? What are the key takeaways of Net Positive?
Well, we wrote the book Net Positive, How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take, to really change the mindset and to show that business really can be done differently, and that different way of doing business is ultimately also more profitable and more successful. So business, I've always believed, can be a force for good and should profit from helping us solve the world's biggest challenges, not frankly creating the world's biggest challenges. So the central ethos, if you want to, of Net Positive is that businesses should give more to the world than they actually take. That might sound counterintuitive, but let me explain. We ask two very simple questions in the book. How can businesses profit from solving the world's problems, not creating them? And the second question is the world frankly better off, yes or no, because your business is in it? So moving from a traditionally simple goal that many companies are focused on, which is maximizing profit, often the quarterly profit, and the traditional CSR principles of buying off some guilt, this would be a business model that we would encourage that actively creates positive societal, environmental, and economic impact. If you look at the state of the world, where we find ourselves today, you can see that most of our planetary boundaries that define our health and the health of this planet are really under pressure. In fact, 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries have already passed what we would call acceptable levels, and many scientists, climate scientists, would argue that we're close to negative tipping points. World Overshoot Day this year was August the 1st, which is the day that we use up more resources than the world can replenish. I would argue that every day after that, we're actually stealing from future generations. So we're living well beyond our planetary boundaries. And yet, if you look at most companies' CSR reports, corporate social responsibility, it talks about a little bit less carbon emission in the atmosphere, a little bit less deforestation in the value chain, a little bit less plastics in the oceans. But when you've overshot these planetary boundaries to such an extent, a little bit less is simply not good enough anymore. Successful businesses, we see increasingly, are the ones that think restorative, reparative, what we call regenerative. So the future belongs to those companies that first and foremost understand that and integrate purpose into their core, take responsibility of the total impact, run their businesses to the benefit of all of their stakeholders for the longer term, see shareholder return as a result, embrace partnership to tackle these tougher challenges that they cannot do alone, and then last but not least, work ultimately with NGOs, governments, and industries alike to what I call get the right frameworks and legislation at times in place, which in the book we describe as positive advocacy, not just lobbying for their self-interest. So increasingly we can find that the companies that operate under that principle attract better people, have more engaged people in their companies, are more innovative, more robust relationships in their value chain, solid relationships obviously with the communities in which they work and operate, and all of that ultimately translates into faster growth and more profitable growth, so that the shareholders also benefit as a result of what you do, not as a myopic objective.
Thank you. Beautiful. And the book obviously goes through all the detailed foundations and the case studies and your story as well at Unilever, which sometimes I think intimidates people thinking that this is only the biggest businesses of the world that are being called to action. And I would love to ask you to home in on the net positive message for the SMEs of the world.
No, thanks for asking, and that's obviously the most important. And we've written some articles about that in Harvard Business Review. But there's no doubt that having been also the chair of the International Chambers of Commerce globally, or the chair of the UN Global Compact, of the World Business Council, it is very clear to me that the SMEs are driving the global economies.
Mm.
Although we talk a lot about the multinationals and they get a lot of attention, the SMEs are really the engine of private sector growth. And that's true for both developed and developing markets. And they're actually critical to implement what you undoubtedly talk, which is the Sustainable Development Goals that we're sort of having as a blueprint for the world. In fact, if you look at the SMEs, they account for about 80 to 90% of the businesses out there, 50 to 70% of the job creation that comes with it. In fact, with the International Chamber of Commerce, we always said 7 out of 10 jobs that are being created are created by SMEs. So whilst undoubtedly the SMEs operate on a different scale than the multilaterals or the multinationals, they have an important role to play to drive this systemic and transformative change that we now need in our economies, and I would argue in our society as well. If you get to goals like in the Sustainable Development Goals, goal number 8 of sustainable growth and employment, or goal number 9 of sustainable industrialization and innovation, goal number 13 of climate action, and the list goes on. It has SMEs written all over it. So they also are important for international trade. We've seen over and over again, increasingly so with climate change, the geopolitical tensions, that our supply chains are broken, that we often depend on small but critical elements in our supply chain. And yes, indeed, many of them are the SMEs that serve as a glue. So there is no doubt that as we need to make this major transition in society, decarbonize our system, we've never done that, change our food and land use systems, and the list goes on, that SMEs are probably lower on the scale of having resources, and that they struggle with the everyday business realities to keep their businesses alive, and often don't have the resources or the funding to work on these bigger projects that multilaterals work, multinationals work on. But that's not a bad thing, to be honest. When we looked at it in the UN Global Compact, where we have 22,000 companies, 90% of them being SMEs, we saw that they struggle with keeping up with legislation, with the reporting, with getting the resources internally to drive on these climate goals and put them into reality. But at the end of the day, I think there are many advantages that the SMEs need to leverage. They're closer to their communities, they're closer to their local legislators where many things happen, they're closer to their employees, they're more agile to respond to changing market conditions. I would argue more innovative in the field of climate change, if you want to, or innovation. Many of the big ideas that we benefit from come from SMEs. I would argue, it might not be a good example, but Elon Musk, which for his good or his bad is revolutionizing the electric vehicle industry, started as a little SME. So being lean and agile and innovative and close to the marketplace are the advantages that SMEs need to exploit. SMEs, for their challenging areas, can tap into resources that are made available. Increasingly, multinationals are responsible for their Scope 3 impact. Most of the SMEs are there. Companies like Microsoft, Salesforce, Apple, Amazon, Walmart, Unilever have put big programs in place to work with the SMEs. We also recognize the importance of that in the International Chamber of Commerce, 48 million companies. So programs like SMEs is everybody's business. The UN Global Compact has wonderful programs to tap into. And so I would encourage the SMEs to obviously rise to this challenge, turn their negatives or their challenges into competitive advantages, and leverage these global networks that are available.
Thank you. And then I'll ask you just a last question. Everybody's so inspired by the message, and I think it'll resonate and ring true that the inhibition is how to start. What are the next steps? Do you have some concrete suggestions that you would give these leaders of the SMEs to move forward? Look.
Well, we work a lot with the SMEs. In one part of my job, we put industry coalitions together. And one of the coalitions we put together is fashion, a very destructive industry that needs to be converted. And many of the fashion companies are small, as you well know. We work with 70 fashion companies in the Fashion Pact. We work with over 100 food companies, many of them small, transforming the food system to regenerative agriculture and all that stuff. So we do deal with a lot of the SMEs that become part of these alliances and benefit from that. But it starts with ambition. You need to set ambition. What do you want? We know that we need to decarbonize. We know what the science tells us. We need to look at our impact across our value chain. If you're small or big, that's where it starts. Get it at the core of your business model. This is not anymore CSR or a side hobby, a way you can get away with selective picking and celebrating one number, but then falling incredibly short on the others. Then the second thing, which is obviously more important for everybody, is to walk the talk, to make public what you do, to track, and certainly to avoid the greenwashing along the way. Then you need to innovate. I mean, the companies that succeed, small and big, and many small companies succeed and thrive because they understand these trends, these signals from legislators, the signals from the marketplace, increasingly from consumers, their own employees, but also signals from the financial world that they depend on or their own value chain. And they respond to that. And they're not afraid to embrace partnerships. With the Fashion Pact, with these many small companies, we've set up the biggest purchase agreement for green energy. Individual companies don't know how to do this. They don't have the scale to benefit from that financially, but collectively they can. So increasingly they move to what I call cooperative partnership for the issues that concern humanity versus competitive behavior. And then last but not least, I would argue, be out there in your local communities, in your regions, in your countries to advocate for what is right. Your voices need to be heard, not only via trade associations, which sometimes might have different interests by organizations that are dominated by the vested order and might lobby for different things, but get enough of the like-minded companies together to do what I call this positive advocacy. It will not happen and it cannot happen without the individual and collective voices of the SMEs. The transformation in society cannot happen and will not happen without having all of the SMEs, which are the core of our economies, transform at the pace and scale that is needed. Many are going, but the issue right now is we're simply not going fast enough. Ultimately, it is leadership. Many people will argue that this is not a crisis of climate change or inequality or food insecurity. They are ultimately symptoms of our shortcomings. Many would argue that this is a crisis of greed, of apathy, of selfishness. So it really starts and ends with leadership. It was Rumi, a poet of the 13th century in Iran, who said it very well when he said, "Yesterday I was clever, I tried to change the world. Today I'm wise, I'm changing myself." And Wangari Maathai, a Nobel Prize winner in Kenya, wonderful lady, she unfortunately passed on, said that there comes a time in history when man is called upon to rise to a higher level of consciousness, which he called the higher moral ground. So my rallying cry to all of you is there's no better time to do that now. And with the cost of inaction increasingly starting to exceed, frankly, the cost of action, my point to any business, small or big, is that this is probably the biggest business opportunity that we're sitting on in this century. So don't miss the boat and start to be heading to the graveyard of dinosaurs, but be sure that you're on the train that frankly already has left the station.
Very clear, very compelling. Paul, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your experience, your wisdom. And I wish you a lovely weekend and look forward to seeing you soon.
Likewise, good luck with the course and thanks to everybody for what you're doing. Highly appreciate it. See you
Excellent.
soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, Paul.
Bye-bye.